I reported my brother to CPS. Now his underground bunker house is gone. I'm 36 years old. For 36 years, I have been the difficult one because I refused to smile while my house was on fire. I'm the daughter of saints. At least, that's what the local newspaper called my parents 10 years ago in a human interest piece. They were the couple that never said no to a child in need. But if you live in a house where the doors are always open, you eventually realize that there are no walls left to keep you safe. I need to explain the why before I get to the what, because people keep telling me I've overreacted. They weren't there. My childhood was a revolving door of other people's nightmares. My parents were, and still are, deeply, performatively religious. They didn't just foster kids, they collected them like merit badges. At any given time, there were 4 to 6 foster kids in our 4-bedroom house, on top of me and my biological brother. The house always smelled like a mix of industrial floor cleaner, cheap laundry detergent, and unwashed fear. My parents didn't have the time or the emotional bandwidth to actually parent anyone. They were missionaries of the home. Their job was to provide the roof, my job, and my brother's job, was to provide the labor. By the time I was 7, I wasn't playing with dolls, I was scrubbing diarrhea out of carpets because a new placement had night terrors. By 10, I was the one making sure the runners, the older kids who tried to bolt every night, didn't actually make it to the highway. My parents were always in the living room, counseling birth parents who were usually just there to manipulate them for money, or they were at church, being held up as pillars of the community. The worst part wasn't the work, it was the righteous gaslighting. If I complained that a foster sibling had stolen my only heirloom jewelry from my grandmother, my mother would sit me down, put her hand on mine, and give me that serene, glassy-eyed look. "You have to have grace, honey," she'd say. "Think of the poverty they came from. You have so much. You have the Lord. You have 2 parents who love you. Why are you being so selfish over a piece of metal?" I grew up believing that my feelings were a sin. My brother, who is 38 now, took a different path. While I became cynical and hyper-independent, he became paranoid. He internalized the chaos of the convict parents who used to hop our fence. He remembered the nights we spent hiding in the bathtub because an addict father was pounding on our front door with a tire iron, screaming that my parents had stolen his kids. My parents called those tests of faith. My brother called them reasons to buy a gun and dig a hole. Even now, family events are a special kind of hell. My parents still foster, and the kids they raised are now adults with their own broken lives. They all flock back to the nest because my parents never say no. A few months ago, we were at a local family diner for a birthday. One of the grand foster kids, a 12-year-old with a history of behavioral issues that no one is treating, decided it would be hilarious to ambush a waiter. He tackled the poor guy from behind. 2 plates of chicken piccata smashed across the floor. Glass everywhere. The waiter was shaking. The manager came over. My parents just smiled that same serene smile. "He's just expressing his joy," my mom said. "He's been through so much transition lately. We should all be patient." They refused to pay for the food. They wouldn't even apologize. I was so humiliated I felt the blood rushing to my face. I walked to the front, paid the $60 tab, tipped the waiter an extra $20, and left. My brother called me a slave to the system for paying the bill. My parents said I was embarrassing the family by acting like the waiter was a victim. That is the level of delusion I am dealing with. My brother bought 10 acres of scrubland about an hour away from the city. It's a literal wasteland, dust, rocks, and dead brush. He told everyone he was building an off-grid sanctuary. My parents cheered him on. They saw it as him finally embracing true values away from the godless government. I didn't visit for a year. I didn't want to see it. But then I heard he had a girlfriend. She was 19. He was 37. It made my skin crawl, but again, in my family, if you voice a concern, you're the judgmental one. A few months later, she was pregnant. No doctors. No prenatal vitamins. No ultrasounds. The human body was designed to do this without interference, he'd tell me over the phone. When the baby was born, they named her something earthy and didn't register the birth. I finally went out there this summer. I thought, maybe I'm being too harsh. Maybe it's a nice cabin. It wasn't a cabin. It was a 20-foot shipping container buried halfway into the dirt, topped with a corrugated metal shed. There was one room. One. The floor was plywood laid over packed earth. The kitchen was a propane camping stove on a plastic folding table. The bathroom was a bucket system in a small wooden lean-to 20 yards away from the main structure. It was 98 degrees outside, and inside that metal box, it felt like an oven. My niece was sitting on a dirty rug, chewing on a piece of plastic. She was covered in heat rash and mosquito bites. Her mother, this 20-year-old girl who looked like a ghost, was trying to wash cloth diapers in a plastic tub of lukewarm water. "We're planning on having another one soon," my brother told me, beaming with pride. "And once we get the second container buried, Mom thinks we could even take in a foster kid or two. Show them how to live without being tracked by the beast." I felt a physical sensation in my chest, like a cord snapping. I looked at the mold growing in the corners of the ceiling. I looked at the lack of ventilation. I looked at the propane tank sitting right next to where the baby slept. I remembered the convict parents and the screaming and the grace I was forced to have while my own safety was auctioned off for my parents' egos. My brother was doing it again. He was recreating the neglect, but this time, he was adding the physical danger of a DIY death trap. "You can't bring a foster kid here, let alone another baby," I said. My voice was flat. "This isn't a house, it's a tomb." My brother laughed. "That's the sheep in you talking. You're just mad you're still paying a mortgage to the banks while I'm free." I drove away. I didn't even make it home. I pulled into a rest stop, took a deep breath, and called CPS. I didn't just report the neglect. I reported the illegal structure. I reported the lack of water. I reported the unrestrained propane. I told them there was a toddler living in a metal box in the desert. I thought they'd just give him a warning. I thought they'd make him move back to my parents' house. I didn't realize how illegal his sanctuary actually was. When CPS arrived with the sheriff, my brother did exactly what I knew he'd do. He started screaming about sovereign citizenship, traveling versus driving, and how they had no jurisdiction over his land. He refused to let them in. That triggered a forced inspection. The building inspector didn't just find violations. He found a death trap. The wiring from the generator was a fire hazard. The waste disposal was contaminating the local groundwater. The structure itself was deemed imminent danger. The county condemned it on the spot. Because it was an illegal, unpermitted structure that was considered a public health and safety hazard, they didn't just tape it off. They brought in the heavy machinery. My brother watched as a bulldozer crushed his fortress into a pile of scrap metal and splinters. They are all at my parents' house now. My brother, his girlfriend, and the baby are squeezed into the guest room. The house is louder than ever. My parents are currently fostering 2 siblings with severe trauma, plus 3 other grandfoster kids whose parents are in various stages of incarceration. It is exactly the environment I spent 18 years trying to escape. And my niece is right in the middle of it. My parents suspect it was me. They keep leaving voicemails about forgiveness and the devil's work. My brother sent me a text that just said, "I hope you're happy with what you've done. You've destroyed the only thing I ever owned." But here's the thing, I don't feel bad. I feel a terrifying lack of guilt. I look at the photos of that metal shed and I know that if a fire had started from that generator, my niece wouldn't have made it out of that single door. I'm going no contact. I've blocked their numbers. I'm moving to a new apartment next month and I'm not giving them the address. I am done being the helper girl for a family that worships at the altar of their own dysfunction. Update. It has been almost a year since the day the county tore that container out of the ground. For a few weeks after everything happened, I stayed away completely. I had already blocked most of their numbers and muted the family group chat. My parents still managed to leave voicemails through other phones. Those messages had the same tone they always used when they believed someone had betrayed the family mission. They spoke about forgiveness and unity while carefully avoiding any acknowledgement that the situation had become dangerous for a child. According to them, I had destroyed my brother's home and humiliated the family in front of the community. News travels quickly in the kind of town we grew up in. People who had praised my parents for years started hearing different pieces of the story. Some believed the version my parents repeated at church, that government agencies had targeted my brother unfairly. Others heard about the conditions inside that container and began asking questions. The truth didn't settle neatly in one place. It moved around depending on who was talking. I tried to stay out of it. For a while I succeeded. I moved forward with the plans I had already made to relocate closer to my job. The apartment I signed for was across the state line in a smaller city where nobody knew my family. That distance helped more than I expected. For the first time since childhood, I wasn't surrounded by people who saw my parents as moral authorities. But distance didn't stop the updates from reaching me. One of my cousins still talks to me occasionally, and she told me how things were unfolding inside the house. Living there again changed my brother's behavior almost immediately. The first few weeks he refused to admit the bunker had been unsafe. He spent hours online posting about the incident and blaming various government departments for destroying his property. At the same time, he had to rely on the same parents he claimed were too dependent on the system. That contradiction didn't seem to register with him. The girlfriend looked worse each time someone described her. When I first saw her at the bunker, she already seemed overwhelmed. Back at my parents' house, she became quiet and withdrawn. She rarely left the room except to take care of the baby or help with chores when my mother asked. The dynamic between her and my brother shifted once they were back in that crowded environment. He became louder and more defensive, especially when anyone mentioned the inspection or the county report. CPS didn't close the case right away. Once they were involved, they had to follow their procedures. Social workers visited my parents' house several times to check on the baby and evaluate the living situation. That house had passed inspections before because my parents had been licensed foster parents for decades. Still, the investigators had to document everything carefully because the initial complaint involved an illegal structure and unsafe conditions. My parents cooperated with those visits the way they cooperate with everything that reinforces their image as caregivers. The house was cleaned thoroughly before each appointment. The younger foster kids were coached on how to answer questions. My mother has always been skilled at presenting the household as organized chaos rather than actual instability. From the outside, it probably looked like a large but well-intentioned family. From the inside, it was the same exhausting environment that defined my childhood. The baby remained in the house during that entire process. She gained weight and looked healthier once she had regular access to basic care. That part of the story never reached the people who accused me of cruelty. They focused on the destruction of the bunker rather than the fact that the child who had been living inside it now had consistent food, running water, and medical checkups. Months passed. The investigation eventually closed with the decision to leave the baby with her parents as long as she remained in a safe environment. My parents' house technically met that requirement, even if it meant the child was now part of the same overcrowded system that shaped the rest of us. The outcome didn't make anyone happy. My brother saw it as proof that the authorities were still watching him. He blamed me openly during family gatherings and online posts. According to him, I had sabotaged the only place he could have raised his family independently. His version of the story framed me as someone who couldn't tolerate a lifestyle outside the control of modern institutions. My parents treated the situation as a spiritual betrayal. They believed family loyalty should override any outside concern. In their world, reporting the conditions of that bunker was worse than the conditions themselves. The girlfriend remained quiet through most of it. She rarely defended my brother publicly and rarely criticized him either. People who saw her in the house described someone who looked tired all the time. Caring for an infant inside a crowded home while living with a partner who was angry about losing everything he built did not leave much space for anything else. About 6 months after the demolition, something happened that shifted the tone of the situation. The girlfriend took the baby and went to stay with her own mother for a few weeks. No dramatic announcement accompanied that decision. She simply packed a bag one afternoon and left while my brother was out with a friend. My parents told relatives it was a temporary visit. My cousin later told me the truth looked different. The girlfriend had been overwhelmed for months and needed distance from the constant tension inside the house. During that time, the baby finally saw a pediatrician for the first full medical checkup since she was born. Nothing catastrophic had happened to her health, but the doctor did note delayed vaccinations and signs of prolonged heat exposure during her early months. The records from that visit became part of the file CPS already had. When my brother learned about the appointment, he reacted the way people expected. He argued with the girlfriend for days about government interference and medical corruption. That argument eventually pushed her back to her mother's house again. The second time she stayed longer. None of that fixed the underlying problems. It only stretched them out. I heard about these developments secondhand while settling into my new apartment. My life looked completely different from the one I left behind. My days were quieter. At the same time, the guilt people expected me to feel never arrived. I understood why they thought it should. In their eyes, I had caused the destruction of my brother's home and forced him back into a place he had tried to escape. What they ignored was the fact that his idea of escape involved placing a baby inside a metal box with no ventilation and a generator running next to the only door. The sadness came from somewhere else. The entire situation revealed how little had actually changed in our family over the decades. My parents still believed intention mattered more than outcome. My brother still believed independence meant rejecting every outside structure, even the ones designed to protect children. The younger generation growing up inside that house was still surrounded by the same instability I had tried to leave behind. A year after the demolition, the family gatherings look almost identical to the ones that made me leave in the first place. The only difference is the baby. She spends most of her time with her mother now, moving between her grandmother's house and occasional visits to my parents when the relationship with my brother stabilizes for a few weeks. She has proper clothes and regular meals. She sees doctors and receives the vaccinations my brother once insisted were unnecessary. None of that erases the damage inside the family. My brother still refuses to speak to me directly. When my name comes up, he describes me as the person who destroyed his life. My parents repeat the same message in softer language, describing the situation as a tragic misunderstanding that fractured the family. For the first time in my life, I did not return to their house during the holidays. I spent that time in my apartment with a few friends who know only the simplified version of my past. They understand that my family situation is complicated, but they don't see my parents as saints or my brother as a martyr. Sometimes I receive updates about the foster kids still moving through that house. The cycle continues exactly the way it did when I was a child. New placements arrive with their own histories of trauma. My parents welcome them with the same speeches about grace and sacrifice. The older ones eventually leave carrying the same confusion about where responsibility ends and self-preservation begins. The sadness in all of this doesn't come from regret about making that call. It comes from recognizing how many years passed before someone finally intervened in a situation that was clearly unsafe. If anyone had stepped in earlier during my childhood, maybe the pattern would have broken sooner. Maybe my brother would have learned a different way to build a life. Maybe the baby would never have spent her first months inside a buried container in the desert. Those possibilities exist only as speculation now. What remains is the reality of a family that never learned to separate good intentions from harmful choices. I stepped outside that structure because staying inside it meant repeating the same story forever. The cost of that decision was the complete collapse of whatever fragile connection remained between me and the rest of them. When people ask how I feel about it now, the answer is not anger and not relief. The closest description is something quieter and heavier. The situation ended the only way it could have once someone reported it. The bunker is gone. The baby lives in a safer place. The family that raised me continues exactly as it always has, convinced that faith and stubbornness will eventually solve problems that have been growing for decades. I no longer wait for them to understand why the call was made. The year that followed proved that understanding was never part of the equation.
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Daily Tales Update for more such stories.